Welcome to a new episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. I'm Luke Shelton.
I'm Sara Westwick.
And I'm Sara Brown.
Each episode, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guests to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
All of this is made possible by our supporters on Patreon. So we want to thank them and encourage you to check out the community at patreon.com/Tolkien Experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. So I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I'm joined by Sara Brown and Oriana Schwindt. Hopefully we'll have another guest joining us in a little bit, and when we do, I'll kind of pause and introduce them as well. So let me go ahead and introduce the 2 guests that we have. As well as I suppose I should introduce myself for people who don't know me. So my name is Luke Shelton. I'm the creator and a co-host of the Tolkien Experience. That's both a podcast and a text project where people can share their responses and their past experiences with Tolkien. It's been going since 2018 now, so 4 years. It's a good one. And yeah, it's always open for new submissions. So if you go to luke-shelton.com, you can see how to share your own experience with us. Next, I'll go ahead and introduce Oriana Schwindt. Oriana is a screenwriter in her own right. She's been an entertainment journalist for a while. She has some great insights about adaptation that I've already heard on her other podcast, which I'll let her go ahead and introduce now.
Yeah, I'm Oriana, and I am one of 3 co-hosts of By the Bywater, which is just, it's me, it's Ned Raggett, and Jared Pekacek, and we're just kind of Tolkien enthusiasts. We're not scholars in our own right, but we are enthusiasts. Long history with Tolkien. I recently transitioned from journalism to screenwriting in the last few years. I just went through the Warner Brothers television writer workshop, which is kind of a TV writer boot camp. And so, yep, lots of experience with adaptation in the TV space in particular. So excited to chat about that for a while.
Yeah, great. And then our other guest is Sara Brown, who is my co-host on the Tolkien Experience podcast. But she's also starting another exciting project that I'll let her tell you about.
Hi, I'm Sara Brown. I work for Signum University alongside Corey Olsen. And as Luke said, I'm a co-host on the Tolkien Experience podcast, along with Sara Westwick. And the exciting new thing I'm going to be doing is, along with James Tauber, also known as Digital Tolkien, we're going to be doing a Rings of Power wrap-up with the Prancing Pony podcast. So they've been doing stuff in advance, obviously, of the drops of the episodes. But as soon as the episodes actually clunk their way onto our TVs, then we're going to be doing our analyses shows. So they will be pretty much immediate after the shows have aired. And when I say immediate, I've already been informed of the very sucktastic hour of the day I'm probably going to be up doing that because I'm in the UK. But the sacrifices one must make for fun, I guess.
To quote a different fantasy series, a very different fantasy series, the things we do for love.
Yes, indeed. And Sara has actually been doing that for quite some time now because of her passion for Signum and for teaching fantasy literature. You've had to do a lot of all hours of the evening classes.
Dude, they got to get you some screeners. Although Amazon with these, even if they gave you screener access, I have some TV critic friends who have it's been a disaster. All sorts of fun jokes about, waiting for the thrush to knock to get access to these screeners.
But yes, Luke, you're right. I'm used to being up at ridiculous hours because that's what you get when you live in the UK, but you work for a US-based university. So, for example, in the upcoming semester, I have a class that is on from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. my time.
Oh, goodness.
Gosh, I hope you're not a morning person.
I'm really not.
Okay, great.
No. Thank goodness I'm a night owl. because the mornings have always been appalling times that I just, but for 30 years as a high school teacher, I got up at 6 a.m. I did my thing and all that, and actually I'm so much happier doing this.
Oh my gosh.
All right, so why don't I get us onto our main topic that we're going to be talking about, because we could chit chat for hours because you're all so personable. Basically, I wanted to kind of get a group together to just talk about kind of, some specifics about Rings of Power and maybe some responses to some of the things that we've seen on commercials and promotional posters and things like that, but also talk more generally about adaptation and adaptation of Tolkien's work, because I think there is a lot more nuance that we can be having in that conversation than I often see in, little 160 or 320 character tweets now, because you just can't get into a lot of depth there. And so it ends up being, fairly shallow in a lot of ways. And so I guess just kind of the first question I can throw out to get us started off is, what do you think are some of the changes that are required for a visual adaptation of a text, like just across the board? So one thing that comes to mind offhand is you just can't have all the descriptions be perfectly right. You're going to have to cave in one way or the other, because the image that you put on the screen is never going to be everyone's mental image. So you kind of have to use whatever descriptions you get as a guideline, but you also have to kind of create your own world to make it consistent. So are there any other things like that you can think of that making that transition from text to screen, you have to make those adaptation choices?
I think for the first thing I think of is how a lot of the way that Tolkien delivers exposition, let's say, is, thinking a lot about the Council of Elrond and the character of Gandalf in particular. He's kind of an exposition machine, and it works really well in the books because he's a lore master. He's been around for a really long time. It is his business to know things and to hypothesize, on that, with that knowledge base. And you can't really have these long, like several pages at a time stories. It's very engaging in the book, but a guy talking on screen like that, people are going to check out. So you have to figure out different ways of delivering this kind of exposition. And I guess where the Rings of Power showrunners are kind of lucky in a sense is that we don't have that. For the Second Age, we don't have people delivering these kind of long monologues about stuff that happened, and I think that they'll shy away from that, and that's good. That and sort of internal emotional states and this is just a classic book to TV or film adaptation. When I was making the transition to writing for the screen instead of writing prose, friends of mine would be like, look, an actor just isn't going to be able to fully do what you want them to do in terms of like, oh, she's thinking about blah, blah, blah. It's like, we really need a way to externalize this that isn't just her face, because actors are pretty good at making faces, but you generally need to pair it with some kind of action. I think they might be overcorrecting in Rings of Power in terms of like, having characters become more action oriented in ways that are actually not congruous with their character. To talk about Galadriel later on, I think. So those are the two like really big things to watch out for.
Yeah, the one I was going to add, which you did, was all the internalizing that you get where, character X thinks to themselves this, or character Y feels this. That's never going to just pick up and translate straight onto screen. So how do you actually deliver that? And I do wonder if we're going to get the same sort of workarounds of the long exposition that Jackson did, where he did, like, for example, the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring that look back into the history and what happened with Sauron and all that kind of thing? Are we going to get those kinds of flashbacks that will give us that rooting into history without someone standing there going, and now let me tell you the tale of how this happened? Because as you say, that's going to be slightly tedious. Although I wonder, we've got like the character that Lenny Henry is playing. He seems like some kind of old wise hobbit who may sit around a campfire and say, let me tell you the tale of X, Y, because you might get that sort of thing going on as well.
They do have a perfect pairing to set that up, because we've seen one of the characters is a younger Harfoot that he could explain things to. It reminds me of, there's a paper that I wrote once about, I think it was Chaucer's House of Fame. And it's all about how like Chaucer does this brilliant thing where he makes his narrator an idiot. And so his narrator just walks around and says, what's this? What's that? And people have to explain it to him the whole time. So you can kind of do the same thing with a young child of they're curious. And so you have to answer their questions. So maybe I could see that working with the Lenny Henry dynamic there.
Yeah, I mean, we get that in the Lord of the Rings. The children like that are the hobbits, aren't they? As they learn. So as they go through the journey and they learn things, we learn that alongside them. But again, that has to be delivered differently on screen to the way in which it's delivered in the book. That's for sure.
That does bring up, oh gosh, I forgot his name. Oh no, I feel horrible. I should have looked this up before. We were recently talking about on By the Bywater, a lecture that was given by, I'm so sorry, man, for forgetting your name. But he was talking about the least knowledgeable character and how Tolkien uses that so well. And the least knowledgeable character shifts from storyline to storyline. And that's a very valuable thing to have. It is odd to me, given the presence of so many different kinds of men in the Second Age, that we're sticking the hobbits in too, as these other probably least knowledgeable characters, or a pool of least knowledgeable characters to provide this way of delivering exposition. It still feels odd to me that we're just shoehorning them in, and it does, to me, that feels like a studio insistence where like there's a lot of people involved in this project, and a lot of them are like very commercially minded. And I get it, TV is a yes, thank you, Jared. It's Michael Drought who delivered the lecture that we were talking about. This is like the second time I've forgotten his name. I'm so sorry, Michael. But producers and studio executives often will need, they're like, we need this link between the Lord of the Rings and this, because people aren't going to get that it's Middle Earth if there aren't hobbits, which just feels kind of craven and silly to me.
But it does remind me of so Shippey had a lecture series a while ago on the Great Courses about kind of the many faces of heroism kind of thing. And his whole lecture on Tolkien is about Frodo, and how Frodo was kind of a revolutionary hero because he is an everyman hero. And so that allows kind of your average reader to participate in a high adventure in a way that more traditional heroes wouldn't. Like you don't identify with the Siegfried as much as you identify with the Frodo, that kind of thing. And so I can kind of understand that angle, but at the same time, you already have a precedent set by Peter Jackson of let's take the high and mighty figures and like lower them just a little bit to try and make them more relatable. I mean, he kind of destroys Aragorn's character to do that in a couple ways. So, I think, I agree that I don't feel like we need to have the Harfoots to be that kind of window into the world. What I'm hopeful then is that they're including Harfoots because why not? I mean, they can be there, but I want them to show a more dynamic people group there than just they're all naive. I don't want that to be the case. I want the Lenny Henry character to be like actually knowledgeable and not just kind of like a sheltered, don't trust the outside world character.
He does seem like he's coming over like that, though, doesn't he? I mean, the Harfoots are very different hobbits to the kinds we encounter in the Shire and the Lord of the Rings.
Mhm.
They're not settled people. They're not the bucolic farmers that we see in the Shire. These are traveling people. These are they move from place to place all the time, and they're constantly shifting exactly where they settle. So these are people who are interacting with their own world in a very different way. By the time we get to the hobbits of the Third Age, we're looking at a people who are not just settled but incredibly insular. To the stage of they don't care what happens outside the Shire, don't want to know what happens outside the Shire. Whereas for the Harfoots, it's more important for them to kind of have their finger on the pulse of what's going on, because it could affect them. They don't have that security. And even, of course, the hobbits of the Shire don't realize how their security is actually. What I'm hoping for with having the Harfoots there, because I see why have we got them? Is it just simply as an anchor into this new way of telling text from Tolkien? I want them to be there for a reason. I want us to see that they are not simply, okay, the elves are doing this and the Númenóreans are doing this and the Harfoots are over here being all sweet. But I honestly think that the tiny, tiny bits we've had from them, with the trailers and stuff, it seems to me like the way in which they're presenting the Lenny Henny, put my false teeth back in, the Lenny Henny, I can't do this, Lenny Henry character, good Lord. It seems to me that he is acting nothing like the hobbits of the Shire, those innocents who are... they're kind of petty and kind of small and particular, and all of those things I've said. It looks to me like maybe the Hogwarts will have some kind of dynamic narrative purpose. That's what I would be looking for. If that's really not there, that will be disappointing.
Yeah. And I think like what's really got me on my guard in particular regarding the hobbits is the names. It feels so like my co-host on By the Bywater, Jared, came up with this, like, the names we've seen kind of sound like they were created via a poorly programmed online name generator, like Poppy Proudfellow and Eleanor Brandyfoot. And it feels very clear that they kind of just took extant Shire Hobbit names and kind of did a remix, where it feels like what they could have done, and I don't know, maybe they will claim to have done this and come up with Brandyfoot, is have gone like to the Bree Hobbit names and, used your Tolkien language expert and kind of asked them to project back from those kinds of names, and considered the fact that this is an unsettled people. They probably have different plant names around them, different flora, like, what about their environments would they use for these names? And it doesn't seem like that's been considered at all.
I mean, Eleanor, that's a little concerning, because of course we know why Sam named his daughter.
Yeah.
Where has Eleanor come from for a Hobbit to have that name?
Exactly. Are they in contact with the Sindarin elves? Okay, you can do that.
Sure.
But it feels odd.
Yeah.
And one thing I would have found interesting is, had they preserved some of the Hobbit Shire names, that would have made sense, like Proudfeet. Well, if you're nomadic people, Proudfeet could make sense.
Sure.
And so you kind of make that a long lineage or something. But I agree that some of the Shire Hobbit surnames just don't really make sense for a nomadic people.
I want to come back to the point you were making about Aragorn, because the fact that Jackson did stuff with Aragorn's character. And you're absolutely right. He really did. And let's not get started on Faramir, because
dude.
Okay, we'll do Faramir in a minute. But Aragorn, the thing that I think Jackson was going for here, and the reason why Aragorn is different to the way in which Tolkien wrote him, is because when Tolkien was writing Aragorn as a hero, Tolkien was looking back to the heroes of the Anglo-Saxon writings. Those kinds of heroes were born to be who they were. They knew that they had, and he would have used doom, but of course, in the sense of meaning fate here, they would have known that this was their path, and this was a path they were born to, and they were following that, and they would come to the end of that path one way or the other. This is who they are. The Aragorn of the Jackson films kind of speaks to a more late 20th century hero who is more diffident, is not born to a fate in the same way. Often our Hollywood heroes fall into being heroes, or are heroes despite themselves, that sort of thing. And I think that might have been what he was trying to do, was to go for a more recognizably 20th century hero type that speaks more to what we're used to in a hero now. Whether that's the right call or not is a whole different thing. But I think that was the reason for some of the differences in Aragorn's character. I don't know. What do you think?
I do think that narratively, a character, the original sin, I think, with the Peter Jackson adaptation of Aragorn is that, and I think, again, some of this probably came from the people holding the purse strings, where they were like, well, we need like a hot, manly action hero as like our protagonist. And it's like, no, he's not the protagonist. And it's like, we don't care. We need to put someone on the movie posters who doesn't look like Elijah Wood. Like Elijah Wood is beautiful, but he's not going to sell tickets. And so I think what they did was they were like, okay, a character who is offered the choice of not being the king or being the king is a little more narratively satisfying, let's say. Whether that actually is more but the perception is that that's a more satisfying, more narratively dynamic thing to do with the character. And I think that is, and again, we can debate whether that actually works, is good. I think that's the motivation there. And I'm really concerned that they're going to kind of Aragorn Galadriel. That's like my main concern with the Amazon series is taking a character and turning her into an action hero.
We have to remember that Galadriel was a warrior. She fought in battles. She fought at the kinslaying against Feanor, her own family. So she took sword against her own people at that point. So there are moments in her life when she has fought in actual battles. Yes, she wasn't at the Nir Nathanoidiad or any of those biggies, but she was at the kinslaying, and she also crossed the Helcaraxe, and you've got to be some badass to do that, actually.
Which is very cool. But I think my main trepidation with that is what I love about Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings is that she is a very different projection of what it means to hold power and wield power. Galadriel's power does not come from violence. And I think that's like turning her into an action hero. And like, the kinslaying is an emergency situation where she had to very suddenly defend her kin against her other kin. It's like a pretty emergency situation. Crossing the Helcaraxe is like, tough to do, but it doesn't involve like violence, and turning her into some sort of commander of armies, to me, feels contrary to what Tolkien was trying to do with the character, which is show this different way that someone can hold and wield power, not at the head of an army, but just having this little area of influence, really. And maybe it's she comes to that place, but it really puts my guard up.
Sure. We have to remember, though, sorry, Luke, we have to remember that this Galadriel of the Rings of Power, Galadriel, if you like, is thousands of years younger than the one that we meet in The Lord of the Rings. This is a pre-Nenya Galadriel. This is a pre-wisdom Galadriel, actually. This Galadriel is the one who told the Valar to get knotted, that she wasn't coming back. She had other things to do. And it says in the Unfinished Tales that one of the reasons why she said nah is because she wanted her power. She wanted her own space to rule. So the Galadriel of the Second Age is a very, very different personage. The one we see in the Third Age in Lothlorien is a very much older, wiser, more experienced elf who inhabits herself in a very different way. She has a great deal more dignity. That power that she wields is not the power of the sword. It's the power of understanding what it is that must be done. Again, the Unfinished Tales tells us that when she is given Nenya, it actually has a real psychological effect on her. It makes her long for the sea and long to go back into the West. But she knows that now that she holds Nenya, now that she holds finally power that she longed for, she actually has to be responsible with it and use it in the way that it's meant to be used. And she has to do that for a very long time by the time we get to her in the Third Age. So I wonder, I get the concern about Galadriel, warrior princess. I get that. I just wonder if what we're going to get is the Galadriel of thousands of years earlier, who has different motivations, different concerns, different desires, and a whole lot less experience. I don't know. I get the concerns, but I just wonder if they can actually pull it off by showing this Galadriel as being a very different Galadriel and interacting with the world in a different way.
Yeah, so, you're totally... Oh, sorry, Luke.
I was just going to say this conversation is bringing up a couple of things for me. The first is that this is a fascinating dynamic because we each have different concerns when we come to this conversation. One was like a textual, one was thinking about the producers and things like that. Whereas my interest has always been the response, and so my perception of Aragorn is what really made me figure out that Peter Jackson changed his character was the number of people who come away from the movie saying, "Man, I really identify with Aragorn." Whereas when you're reading the books, most people go, "Man, I really identify with Frodo or Sam or Merry or Pippin." And we're on the level of the hobbits with the books. And the men and elves and Maiar are like above our pay grade in the books. It's like we're just kind of watching them do their cool stuff.
Yeah.
And so really that's where my entry point into that conversation is just the different impact those changes have on the consumer of whatever media we're talking about. But then the two of you having this conversation about Galadriel, I'm getting flashbacks of some of the conversations surrounding Wonder Woman when that movie was produced about how her version of strength was not to kill. It was not to violently harm people. It was to have the lasso of truth and make people tell the truth. And it was a more passive, but just as passive is the wrong word. It was a less violent, but just as important power that she wielded. Now, of course, I think we have a very large distinction to make here because we have kind of a lot more history and growth of character to work with than I think in the DC universe they have. I'm not saying that Wonder Woman isn't a dynamic character, but she's not thousands of years old. So, yeah, I don't know what to make of those connections yet. It was really striking me that it kind of sounds like I totally understand being connected to a character that we've seen, but at the same time wanting to explore new aspects of that character. And how do we do that in a way that kind of honors and respects the previous iteration in a way?
Yeah. In addition to, it's so funny to me, given like Tolkien does have, misogynistic tendencies that have revealed themselves in various ways in his work, but yet like. One of the things I loved the most about Éowyn's arc is that it isn't about a woman who like it's not the story of a woman who she just realizes that war is for men and healing is for women, which I think is like kind of a common, really surface level reading of that arc. For me, it was the story of a woman who like spent a really long time kind of seeking the end of her own life and realizing that her time and energy is actually better spent as a steward of life, which was really meaningful for me. And I like, it's fascinating that like, we can see it maybe a Galadriel who goes through like, not the same arc, but maybe a like, here's what I think power is, in my earlier years, and here's what I think it is at the towards the end of my time in Middle Earth, let's say. And that can be really interesting. But I really hope that the makers of the show have been really cognizant of that question of what is power and what does it mean to the people who are wielding it in this world. And I just kind of concerned that everyone was a little too, well, oh, Game of Thrones did it this way and people loved that. So let's kind of talk about it in the same way.
I hope they don't do that.
I hope, I really liked Game of Thrones, the show. Don't get me wrong, for the 4 seasons.
Yeah.
The first 4 seasons. I genuinely enjoyed it because it's, we can like multiple things, but not the treatment that I would like here.
No, it's a very different world. But I think that 2 things from what you said. I think if they don't deal with the issue of power, that's going to be a massive hole, because it's all about power, isn't it? What is power? What does power mean?
It's called the Rings of Power.
Right. So I'm hoping they deal with that. But also, we apparently have 5 series. I want to see a character arc for Galadriel. If she's going to start off with the sword wielding badassery in season 1, I want to see her understanding power and becoming something different by the end of season 5. If we don't get a character arc, if she's still the same Galadriel in season 5 as she is in season 1, that will be very disappointing. Obviously, I have no idea where they're going in terms of, okay, season 1's going to do this, season 2 is going to do this, or anything like that. But there should be, in 5 seasons, there should be plenty of room for character development. And I want to see her moving towards that wisdom and understanding that we see in the Third Age. So that is something I will be looking for.
And it is one of the things that they've done, and that this is just kind of the way that streaming TV works now, is the entirety of the first season and almost all of the second season were written before they shot the first season, which is kind of a problem for a lot of reasons. The main one being you aren't seeing how your cast is interacting with each other. And that can provide you a lot of storytelling avenues that you just don't get. And I think that's kind of, I'm hoping that, everything turns out great anyway, but I don't know, man. Like, because what if, in the shooting, they discover things about Galadriel and her arc and the way she interacts with certain characters that just like that. Well, we already wrote all these scripts for the next 3 years. So sorry.
Interesting thing. I mean, how dynamic is it with the screenwriting?
Mm-hmm.
Go on and think, well, actually, we want to do, and then go to season 2 and go, we need to tweak this. We need to, would they do that? Is that a thing?
It depends. It depends on how far along, well, once you've written a full season and generally you let the writers go. So then all of the burden of rewriting falls on the showrunners and maybe an executive producer that is also a writer. And that can just kind of really gum up the works too. Like, they might decide it's not worth the expense. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
So for a little bit of insight, I follow some of the writers on Twitter and things like that. And one of them posted a picture of all the writers from the recent premiere in Los Angeles, I think it was. And the caption was like, all of the writers together for the first time in 2 years or something like that. So clearly they didn't have writers around, during the filming for a long period. So it's like Oriana is saying, like, if they're doing rewrites now, it's not those original writers, it's other people kind of trying to piece together and stuff like that. But I wanted to go back to kind of this concern about the Game of Thronesing of Lord of the Rings, if you will.
That should be
because this comes back to a quote that comes up a lot in these kinds of discussions from Tolkien's letters, of course. And so I'm going to read the quote and then we can talk about it. So it's from letter 210 to Forrest J. Ackerman. And it's a short paragraph. Tolkien says, the canons of narrative art in any medium cannot be wholly different, and the failure of poor films is often precisely in exaggeration and in the intrusion of unwarranted matter owing to not perceiving where the core of the original lies. And so I think to some extent, I think we can address the Games of Thrones thing, because I think a lot of us feel, a lot of people I've had conversations with realize that kind of the core of Tolkien is not the same as the core of Game of Thrones. Because I think even didn't G.R.R. Martin say that he was driven to write Game of Thrones because Tolkien didn't address kind of the political stuff that he wanted to see?
It is specifically a response to the sort of high fantasy genre. Like,
he wanted to know what Aragorn's tax policy was.
And so I feel like we can talk a little bit about kind of what is the core of Tolkien to us, perhaps, or what is it that we think makes the core of one fantasy or one adaptation different from another. So I also think we could say that the core of the Bakshi Lord of the Rings is not the same as the core of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings, even though, there are a lot of similarities and like stolen shots from one to the other and things like that. But I do think each new interpretation has to find its own core in a way, while also, like we were talking about almost with the Wonder Woman thing, also trying to reflect and respect the core of the previous in a way. Did I ask a good question there?
Yeah, I'm thinking, Sara, do you have thoughts you can say right now? I'm pondering.
I think a lot of it is down to the fact that it would need to come back to this idea of adaptation. It's in the interpretation of the person who is producing that adaptation. So what is it that Bakshi wanted out of the text? What was the main message for Bakshi from the Lord of the Rings that he wanted to convey through his particular adaptation? How different is that to Jackson? When Jackson read the Lord of the Rings and he said, right, I want to adapt this, what had he taken from the text that he wanted to put front and center and make the most important thing about the text? And I think that's where we get the differences in adaptations. I'm just running this off the top of my head, but I think that's where it comes from. It's in the vision of the maker, the one who is actually producing the adaptation. Because, of course, it comes down to, it's a bit like reader response, isn't it? Every reader who reads The Lord of the Rings will read something different into it because they are different to the next person who reads The Lord of the Rings. And so anybody who's going to adapt The Lord of the Rings is going to be interpreting it, taking from it, understanding things from it that they wish to convey in their adaptation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think we can actually push that reader response theory stuff a little bit further, if you don't mind me doing so, because it's kind of stuff that I talk about a little bit.
Is that?
I think we can actually talk about every production as having an interpretive community. And so all writers, all actors, all cinematographers, directors, they all have their own interpretation that they project onto either their character or onto the story they're writing or something like that. The director in many senses kind of has the final say because he's the one sitting there managing the final project. But each of them is bringing their own hopes, aspirations, goals, interpretations to whatever part of it that they're doing. So together they work as an interpretive community in which the director kind of has the final say. And so I think absolutely the director's vision from one director's vision will make one adaptation different from another director's vision in another adaptation. But even if you had the same director and different actors, or even if you had the same the actors and director and a different writer or something like that, it's going to give you different adaptations each time because the different pieces of the interpretive community change the overall outcome. If that makes sense.
And this is where like television is a very different beast in particular, where actors often end up as the sort of guardians of their own characters simply because the way television is produced is very different from a film. Like they're both extremely collaborative efforts, but you've just got a lot more people involved and it's sort of a rotating door. So like J.A. Bayona directed the first 2 episodes of The Rings of Power, but other directors came in after to sort of ape the tone that Bayona set, basically. And like the point of TV directing is not to put your own sort of spin on things, it's to kind of keep the train running. And then you also have, the showrunners are theoretically there all the time. They're a bit more analogous to the director of a film, but at the same time, they can't be everywhere at once. And it often does come down to the actors to kind of be the actors and the writers, if there's one on set. And in a case like the Amazon production, there just wasn't because of COVID, and also streaming productions are for whatever reason trying to not have the writers on set anymore. It's great. It's super fun. Yeah. And I've got thoughts. But it is this like stew that can throw a lot of wrenches into any adaptation, and you can have a lot of competing visions that just kind of continue because we just have to keep shooting and we just kind of have to keep going. Like, the director may think, we'll just keep going with Galadriel. The director might think Galadriel should do one thing and the actor is like, no. So they shoot it 2 ways. Who ends up deciding? It's usually the showrunner, but sometimes there's a studio exec. So like, there's just all sorts of possibilities for like whose vision is really coming to the screen. Anyway, it's weirdly complicated.
Yeah. And it reminds me of, talking about the actors kind of taking on the responsibility for characters, how a lot of kind of longer running series, if they, what they'll end up doing, and especially Star Trek Next Generation did this a lot, the actors will then come back and start directing episodes and things like that. Just because they've been in those characters for so long, they're like, oh, I have an idea of what we can do. And then they get involved in that other part of the process. But yeah, to me, I think you're both exactly right on having to find the core as a group, each new adaptation. So I guess this also brings up, because when we're dealing with adaptations, we already talked about, we have to make changes for a visual adaptation. Are there times when trying to be too faithful to the book backfires. I'll give one example that's probably a bad example, but I'm going to steal it from Corey Olsen, so blame him if it's not a good example.
I can't blame my boss. That's bad.
He pointed out that the dune worms from the Hobbit movie
oh my God.
were actually inspired by this one throwaway passage in The Hobbit where they were the woolly worms of the East or something like that. And so his example is they were trying to find something from the book to secretively get the orcs there, and they just found something and went with it. So instead of just making something up that made more sense, they were trying too hard to go back to the book to find something. Are there other times like that when trying to be too faithful to the book might get in the way of a successful adaptation?
Well, I think that's a fascinating question. I'm going to let Oriana take that one.
This was actually something that I found in the Bakshi version, where the dialogue is very, very faithful to the book, and it just doesn't land. Like I am less critical than some, I think, of Tolkien's dialogue in the novels, but you very quickly see the limitations when people are actually speaking the words. You're like, oh, there's something about this that doesn't quite thing. And I think that like there's much to enjoy about the Bakshi version and just kind of discuss in general. But for me, one of the biggest things that just did not work for that movie was sticking so faithfully with the dialogue.
So I have a question, like a follow-up question to all of that. We hear this idea of being faithful to Tolkien, and it comes out a lot on, people discussing Rings of Power on Twitter and things like that. And they're talking about how it needs to be faithful to Tolkien. What does that really mean?
Well, you notice I didn't say faithful to Tolkien. I said true to the text.
True to the text.
But I mean, if you are adapting Tolkien's work in whatever way, I mean, Jackson, Bakshi, etc., were adapting an actual written text, whereas Rings of Power are adapting bits from here and bits from
vibes,
there, writing into the gap. Okay, what does it mean then to be faithful to Tolkien?
Nothing. I don't actually believe that, but like it does feel like it's so vague as to like people who usually say that mean faithful to what I imagine a Tolkien story means, which kind of goes back to Luke's question about the core. What is the core of Tolkien? And it's whatever you want it to be, I guess. Like, I think we can all agree on certain like philosophical underpinnings, but there's so much that you can just kind of debate, respectfully, and sometimes not so respectfully. I do think that when a lot of people talk about being faithful to Tolkien, to the text, they are simply saying, but it needs to match what I've got up here in my head.
Yeah. And actually you kind of preempted my last question, which is what, do we ignore Tolkien entirely? Or, and how do we...
Oh, death of the author.
How do we treat Tolkien, like authorial intent or wishes versus the text? Like people love to pull out the letters and say, but this, but that, but this, that. And I love to point out, they don't have the rights to the letters. They have the rights to the appendices. Like, yeah, Tolkien said a lot of things, and he said contradictory things at times, like depending on who he's talking to. So it's, they're left with the text and what can they make out of the text. But yes, it's this whole death of the author question to what, and I think a lot of that is a question of what is explicit versus what is implicit in the text, and how do we decouple what is implicit for me from what is implicit to another reader versus, and those kinds of interpretive decisions. Yeah, but I just thought of that. They don't have the rights to the letters line, and I like it.
Yeah, tweet it. I don't think you can uncouple that. Like, that's kind of the problem with like the human experience, maybe, is like I'm pretty dead set on what I think things should look like. And maybe I can be swayed, maybe I can't, but like it's really difficult to decouple those on an individual basis, at least, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, that's absolutely true. I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with the power. And I'm willing to wait and watch the whole of the first series before I actually give any kind of critical evaluation. But at this point, I can't tell you, how will I know if it feels like Tolkien's world?
Yeah.
Actually don't know. And I think that's because it's such a combination of many things, which includes, okay, if you're going to take a character who actually exists, I want to see what you do with that character. And if you make that character Faramir, do bad things with Faramir, I am not going to be happy about that. If you're going to make up characters, they need to fit in that secondary world and be there for a reason. They need to be there for a purpose. And not do stupid things like make Farazon a nice guy, that kind of thing. But what does it actually mean to me to watch it and go, yeah, that feels like Tolkien? At this point, I really couldn't tell you. And I don't think I'll be able to tell you until I watched it and said, yeah, it's this and this and this that makes me feel like it is or isn't Tolkien-esque. But you're right, Luke. We can't just go with, well, Tolkien wanted this and Tolkien said that, because Tolkien said a whole lot of contradictory stuff. I mean, if we want to, get started on all the contradictory stuff he said, we'd be here for another hour. I'm not saying that we utterly ignore the author, because the author did produce the text and look at that text and, adapt that in such a way that people at least recognize the secondary world building that went on. But on the other hand, we can't just go, oh, well, Tolkien said this, so we must do that, because that doesn't work. I mean, for one thing, it was published in 1955, The Lord of the Rings. Well, things move on, things change, cultural ideas change. So there's all of that's got to play in. And the other thing is that I'm hearing a lot of on Twitter of people saying, it's got to be faithful to The Lord of the Rings. I'm like, whoa, dude, no, it's not The Lord of the Rings. It's absolutely not The Lord of the Rings. It's Second Age. And they have only certain rights, which means that they're going to be writing into a lot of gaps. So again, what is it going to mean to be faithful? And I don't have an answer to that. I really don't.
Right. Outside of really big, again, philosophical underpinnings where like, the Lord of the Rings and the stories from the Second Age are intrinsically anti-imperialist, anti-fascist. Like that's just kind of like baseline. So you can't like say it's cool and good that the Númenóreans become a slave empire. You can't portray that as a positive thing. That would not be faithful to Tolkien, I guess. But outside of that, I'm not really sure. Like, I totally agree.
Wish I had the answer. I'd phone up Anderson and say, you really need to hire me. I have all the answers now. You're going to make everybody happy.
So this also makes me wonder about, to steal an old theory for literary criticism, the anxiety of influence of like one adaptation to the other. So like, we know that there are some scenes from Bakshi that influenced Jackson because he's kind of come out and said it.
So much shot. So yeah.
Right. And Jackson's movies were just so influential at the time that I am curious as to how much of an influence they will have. And I know that there are some things that, they got rights to do use some of the same materials and things like that. But for instance, I don't know what you do to depict the scope of Middle Earth if you don't do a bajillion panorama shots like Jackson does.
Right.
Like I have friends every year that do a drinking game marathon, and every time there's a panorama, you have to take a drink of your beer, and no one ever makes it.
Oh
Like,
my God.
like he does panoramas all the time.
Amazing. Because how could you not? It's New Zealand.
Right.
Right.
But
Yes.
at the same point, this is not movies, even though it has a ridiculous budget. They might not be
it's
able
more expensive.
Yeah, they might not be able to do that throughout the entire series and maintain it like you could for the movies. I'm not sure, but like, did those kinds of things that Jackson did continue to have an influence just because it was so influential?
Mm-hmm.
And truth be told, I have not been shy about saying I disagree with using the exact same visual artist, the exact same scholar, the exact same, because to me, it's kind of like, well, those people had their say. They were involved in one of the most successful movie ventures of all time. Let's get some other input here. Like, there are a lot of other visual artists and a lot of other Tolkien scholars. So let's mix things up some. So I think in that way, I feel like there will be a lot of crossover. And so I'm hoping that they do break the mold in several unique ways. And I'll just have to see what that is. But I am curious how much they'll kind of break off in new directions and how much they'll maintain a lot of the same identity as Peter Jackson's films.
Yeah, I mean, the films are 20 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know, don't even. The films are 20 years old. And I love your point, Luke, about how there are other scholars, there are other thinkers, there are other writers, there are other artists. And the world has moved on in its thinking in 20 years as well. There are new perspectives to be had on Tolkien. And I would have loved to have thought that they were drawing on newer scholars who have these new and interesting perspectives on Tolkien's work. And that, for me, would produce a whole new vision of Tolkien that I'm not talking about changing Tolkien completely. I'm talking about allowing for new perspectives that actually would give us something fresh on Tolkien. We should be able to have fresh perspectives. Especially, as I said, the films are 20 years old. Now, the artists that they are using are excellent artists, don't get me wrong. They are superb artists, but there are some amazing artists now too, whose perspectives and visuals of Tolkien's world would give it a little bit of a fresh outlook.
Zhuzh. Zhuzh it up.
Yes, absolutely. Give it a zhuzh that I think actually would have benefited them. Yes, the visuals that we've got so far, they look very interesting. They look very grand. They look very Jackson. Let's see what happens with that. But it would have been so thrilling to have heard that they were working with new academics who could give them different ideas about how to read the action, the narrative, and the characters.
I'm with
sorry,
you.
By the way, I'm here. Amazon, give me a call.
Dude, that was one of the reasons I transitioned from journalism to screenwriting, was like, oh, what if I could write for the Lord of the Rings show? Wouldn't that be cool and interesting? And that is not going to happen for a variety of reasons, especially at this point, I think. But I do hope it's good. I would love I love liking things.
Yes.
There's nothing I like more than liking things.
Yeah, no, I am really looking forward to it. I really want to see what's happening. One of the things I'm excited about is the idea that it will bring new people to Tolkien, just like the Jackson films did. We had so many people who actually came to Tolkien's writing. Thank you, the Jackson films. And I had somebody ask me on Twitter a very good question yesterday or the day before, which was, well, didn't the Jackson films fundamentally change the way in which you read Tolkien? So you open The Lord of the Rings and you see Frodo as Elijah Wood. I said, well, yeah, that may well be the case, but it doesn't change the text.
Yeah.
It's still Frodo's 33rd birthday at the very part of the text. He's still 50 when he heads out on the road, so even if you're visualizing Elijah Wood, who bless him was 19 when he started.
No,
I know, a baby. To me, that doesn't really matter. What matters more is you enjoyed the films, you want to read the books. I am here for that.
it's great.
That absolutely. And if the one thing that Rings of Power does is it brings more people to reading not just the Lord of the Rings, not just the Hobbit, but diving into the appendices and the unfinished tales and the History of Middle Earth series and all of that extra stuff that is out there, so they can really bury themselves in the lore of the world. I just say yay to that. That's what I would like.
Oh yeah, and engage critically with the material too. Like, I love the material, but I can also like look at things and go, okay, what are we doing here? What is this? What are we? What's happening? Why? Okay, like, why did he do this? What purpose does this serve, etc.? Like, I would love for more people to do that. I'm one of the. I had read the series just before the Jackson movies came out. I was like, when I was like 12 or 13.
Oh, shush.
And the movies came out relatively quickly after I had read it for the first time. So I imprinted on the movies really, really well. Like, so I am one of those people. I open the book to reread, and I do see a lot of the visuals. And part of that is because I have that thing where I actually can't form pictures in my mind when I read.
Yeah. Some people really.
And so like, it's actually extremely helpful for me to have those images to pull from. Like, yeah.
Yeah. This conversation is bringing up a lot of things for me. It reminds me, I was having a conversation with, I believe it was Diverse Tolkien, who was talking about discounting the movies or discounting the audiobooks and preface for the text itself is inherently ableist, because not everyone can approach the text in the way that the prescriptivists want them to. Mm-hmm. And so using the movies or an audiobook as an aid to help understand or comprehend the text is important. And you can also think, for every person who had their reading influenced or changed by the movies, well, there's probably also a person who came to the book that wouldn't have come to the book without the movies. Mm-hmm. There's probably also a person whose reading was very much set in stone prior to the movies. So no, it in fact did not change. Mm-hmm. Like for me, I was about the same with you, Oriana. I think I was 11 when I first read the books, and the movies came out shortly after. You already knew that, Sara.
I know. I just know I'm the old one in the room here.
But
wisdom.
Like I already had my characters cemented. So like the only one for me that kind of blends is Ian McKellen, because I mean, how could it not? But all the others, I don't picture Elijah Wood as Frodo, mostly because like Elijah Wood has like anime eyes and my Frodo doesn't.
Just
yeah. So like there are a lot of ways in which my reading is still very much my own, and a lot of ways in which Jackson's reading has influenced my reading. But guess what? So has every other reader that I've ever talked to about the stories. So like one of my favorite things to talk about is how when I first read The Lord of the Rings, I was afraid of Tom Bombadil. Like, because Gandalf said, don't trust anyone. And here you got this guy who comes, takes him out of a magical tree, puts him in a magical house where they're having nightmares. Why would I trust this guy? He's taking the ring. He's putting it on. It seems to not make a difference to him. Like, this guy is too strong to be a good guy. Like, I didn't trust him until he put them back on the road and said, like, good luck on your adventure. I'm going to walk away. You know? And it wasn't until
great tension there. Yeah.
It wasn't until I talked to other people about like, oh, like he's supposed to be like a natural spirit good guy. It's not supposed to be like, is this a mugger on the highway? Or like, so naturally I just kind of over time shifted my perspective, but that was very much my own reading to begin with. And so I don't think we should lambast one adaptation for interacting with people's interpretations any more than we lambast other people for having their own interpretations.
And I love your point about it being ableist. That is absolutely true. As someone who spent 30 years as a high school English teacher, I will tell you that if there was an audiobook available for a text we were doing, I was highly recommending that audiobook. Because audiobooks are absolutely excellent for accessing the text. And the argument that the film could change your visualization of what you are reading, you'd have to put the same then to the audiobook. You know, the first audiobook of The Lord of the Rings I listened to was Rob Inglis. So surely the characters and the way in which he voiced them is going to affect the way in which I hear them. Maybe. Does it matter?
Right. Why does anyone else care about how I visualize or hear the characters?
Yeah. So that argument, it didn't really hold for me, because I just thought it doesn't really matter in the end.
No,
not at all. The only thing, of course, that you've got to be super careful of is when you think something that happened in the film actually happens in the book, like skateboarding elves or things like that. So you do have to be slightly careful about that. But when it comes to visualization, I don't think that there is an issue there at all. So the other point I wanted to quickly go back to, Oriana, is you were talking about how we can look at certain things in Tolkien and think deeply about them. And I think that's really important. There has been some very important conversations, and this goes back to my use new scholars kind of thing. Very important conversation about race and gender and culture and othering and all sorts of things with Tolkien's text. Those would have been interesting perspectives to have had when producing a new version of Tolkien's writing 20 years after the Jackson films. I'm going to be looking at how they portray the other.
Yeah.
And that to me will be very, very interesting, because a lot of what Jackson did was problematic in how he portrayed the other. I want to see how Rings of Power handles that. They handle it any better.
Yeah, the orc question in particular of what are the orcs, what are their origins, how, Tolkien waffled a lot, not to like plug By the Bywater too much, but we did an episode about the orcs that dives into like, ooh, God, the least lovely to European eyes Mongol types. It's oh my God, dude.
Yeah.
But, Tolkien himself waffled a lot on what the orcs actually are. Are they beasts? Do they have like animating spirits? Like what? And like the question is never fully settled, but it seems like the Amazon series is going to deal with that in some way. And I'm a little curious to see how.
They do. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really interested to see how they deal with that. But I think this is where they may have missed a trick in not having new voices behind the scenes, is that, let's see how they deal with those things that are problematic in Tolkien's text and remained problematic in Jackson's version. Let's see what happens with Rings of Power.
Well, and so I should clarify, we know that Shippey worked on the project. We know he left the project, and then we know here at the end that Simon Tolkien was involved with the project. We don't know when Simon came on board, what his role was necessarily, and we don't know like if perhaps there was a different scholar brought on board after Shippey who has not been publicly recognized or something like that. So they could have had other scholars, but we're discussing about things that we know publicly.
Yeah. And we don't know who on the writing staff might just be like an enthusiast, a devotee, like an amateur scholar on their own. It's possible.
And the other thing I wanted to mention was there's this brilliant Tolkien scholar named Robin Reed who deals with a lot of the more difficult topics to grapple with, things like appropriation and racism and sexism, things like that. And I took a course with her one time at Signum, and one of the writings that she recommended was this blog post called "How to Be a Fan of Problematic Things," and it's this brilliantly kind of clear laying out of it's okay to enjoy problematic things, but with that comes the responsibility of acknowledging the problems that it has. You can't just wash over the problems, because that's when it becomes, I'm trying to not say problem over and over again. That
harmful, perhaps.
Right, exactly. It's when you start perpetuating the problems in the writing itself because you're not acknowledging them. That's when it hurts people around you.
Yeah.
And so that was a brilliant post, and that's informed a lot of the interactions I make on social media when I'm engaging with people about this topic of just, yeah, we absolutely have to talk about the racism of the text and the racism of the Jackson movies, and how, like, you know, Tolkien's racism is kind of more anti-Asian, and the PJ Films racism is kind of more anti-Black in a lot of ways. Just like a lot of the decisions made in the costuming and the props and makeup and things like that shifted the racism, which is a weird phrase to say. It made it different, and you know, it's not something that a lot of people who now don't want to have a Black elf want to talk about, because it's like, yeah, Peter Jackson still had problems with racism in his movie. And if we just ignore that and don't talk about it, we end up perpetuating the problems that were in the original and then in that adaptation.
Which, of course, is then exclusionary, because, you know, people of color will look at it and think that's not a text for me. I myself in it. And that's a sad thing, actually. And again, that's why it's important to have a more up-to-date perspective on Tolkien than the 20-year-old set of films. So anyway, that's something I'm going to be looking out for and see what they do with that.
Fantastic. So I've gotten through my 4 questions, and it was enough to get us through an hour and 20 minutes. Awesome. Sara, did you have a couple questions for us, or did we cover them?
We covered them, actually. I was really interested in, you know, what does it mean to be faithful to a text or to an author? Because I think that's a really, really tough question. But it is one that is getting bandied around on social media a heck of a lot. And I just, you know, I wanted us to point out, which is what we did point out, which is that is almost unanswerable as a question. So yeah, we kind of covered everything I was hoping to cover.
I mean, I think being true to Tolkien is just honoring those wedding vows that you made to him. You know, just really sticking with him through thick and thin, sickness and health.
I've been cheating on him with Le Guin. Sorry.
Oh, don't get me started on Le Guin. I love her stuff.
I've been on him with Terry Pratchett for a long time.
Oh, boy. You're in a triad.
Yes, I know, but it's a fun one.
There was a very, very prominent Tolkien scholar who was giving a talk about who was taking on the mantle of Tolkien, and it was at a very, very big conference. I think Sara knows what I'm talking about. And his 3 people that he said were going to take on the mantle were all men. And I just want to stand up and be like, what about Ursula Le Guin?
Right? Come on.
I know.
She's right there.
By any chance? Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah. But yeah, I love Le Guin, and she deserves all the props. And I'm also excited for the adaptation that's going to come for her Earthsea series, hopefully before too much longer.
the good one, the real one.
Yeah.
Not like the last one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We all make mistakes, I guess.
The last one where Ged's like a surfer dude or something.
Vancouver surfer boy. Budgets are hard.
Another person who I think is in the running for taking the mantle of Tolkien would be someone like N.K. Jemisin.
Oh
Yeah, very true.
Oh yeah, there's the Stone Sky, like that's been in development for a long time.
Yeah.
What's happening? Come on, guys. Let's go.
Yeah, let's get on with that.
All right. So, Oriana, did you have anything else you wanted to talk about?
Oh, I had like a whole thing about the Game of Thronesification of Lord of the Rings real quickly, which was, I like just finished reading this book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, which is David Graeber and David Wengrow. And in it, they talk about how we kind of lack the language to talk about societies that don't have the kind of hierarchies we view as endemic to humanity. And I promise this is relevant. But before I read that, it occurred to me that we're having a similar problem with the way that people are writing and talking about the Rings of Power, and in particular, the characters in it. And it occurred to me that people are insisting on fitting descriptions of characters and societies into very Game of Thrones-like terminology, because first of all, Game of Thrones was just a huge cottage industry within entertainment journalism, and editors and writers do not know any other way to write about fantasy on television. I now think it's kind of a deeper problem where we just don't know how to talk about the power structures of Middle Earth. A lot of them are kind of alien. Like, we can, the Rohirrim are very recognizable to us as a society, and even Gondor to an extent, because they're very militarized when we see them. But a lot of other societies in Middle Earth, we just don't really know how to talk about them. Like, they're very alien to us. And so we see publications using this weird language, like describing Elrond as a canny politician or an architect, and it's just baffling to me that like no one seems to have any way of actually describing stuff. Like there was I think it was Vanity Fair, where they described Quenya as the language of ritual and magic. And it's like, oh, brother, like, how did this happen? How do we, what game of telephone happened here? Where was it, the showrunners gave an interview and the writer, is paraphrasing what they said. And an editor is like, I don't understand what this means. Oh, you're saying it's kind of like Latin. So like ritual and elves are magic. So here, ritual and magic. And it's like, but it is weird to me that we just don't have the language to talk about this world in the way that we probably should. Anyway, that's my little soapbox.
Well, perhaps we'll get an anarchist commune who takes it in her turn to act as a kind of executive authority.
Cool.
Sorry, I had to get some Monty Python in there.
Right.
And then I guess I had avoided bringing this back up because I imagine it will be a good final tangent. But Faramir, did we want to wrap up by talking about Faramir?
Do we have 6 hours?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, my boy Faramir was done dirty in the Jackson
So
film.
dirty.
Oh,
So dirty.
Man, I know what justification they gave for having Faramir actually tempted by the ring. The idea that they'd spent all of this time building up the ring to be this thing that nobody could actually resist. And then along comes this guy who says, I would not touch this thing if it lay by the wayside. And they thought that it would ruin the whole thing. But instead they ruined Faramir.
My boy. They massacred my boy.
They did terrible things to Faramir. Go on, I'll let you speak, Oriana.
No, I just agree with you completely. It was just such a bummer. And again, I understand the reason. That doesn't mean I have to like it.
No.
Yeah. Hoping we don't see more of that.
The other character change that is still uneasy for me is Gollum. Like, I understand the split personality thing. Like, I understand how you do that visually to like interpret like his internal struggle. You're externalizing it so the audience can follow it and everything. But every time I see it, I'm just like, Gollum doesn't have multiple personality disorder. And even if he did, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. Like, it just, yeah, that one, like, I think it was a brilliant decision in the moment to try and convey that to an audience.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I wonder if they hadn't made that decision, could we have made kind of a more subtle and complex character?
Right.
That's not just him kind of doing a panto about his feelings every 5 seconds and swapping back and forth.
You
Right.
wanted subtlety in a Hollywood blockbuster? Come on, man.
I think apart from the Faramir done dirty, the other change that Jackson made was Frodo sending Sam away on Cirith Ungol, which broke my heart because no.
It's about friends. They're the core relationship.
They are the core relationship. The one thing that would never have happened is one, Frodo sending Sam away, and two, Sam going, okay, then I'll leave. That's no, I can even just about put up with elves at Helm's Deep.
Oh, that was going to be mine.
but no, Frodo sending Sam away on Cirith Ungol was a no from me.
Yeah, it is one of those where it's like, oh God, you're trying to like introduce conflict where there doesn't need to be further conflict. We already have enough conflict here. You're
Especially about to Shelob's lair.
Yes. It's a hat on a hat. That's the industry phrase for it is it's a hat on a hat.
Right.
All you need is one.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that phrase. I've not heard that one before.
What if it's one of those hats that's an umbrella on top of it? But I want to put it on top of my hat to protect my hat.
You could do that. And people would make fun of you for it.
Of course.
Yes, rightly so.
So I have to admit, my biggest holdup about the Jackson films when first seeing them did not involve a sentient character. It involved Caradhras. So just how they made Saruman responsible for the snows on Caradhras, that was a no for me. I actually yelled no out in the theater.
Yeah, because animism is actually one of the really important ways in which the secondary world is working, and it took the malice of the mountain away and gave it to a magician.
Yeah.
No.
Well, and apparently, subsequently, someone has told me that in one of the commentaries, Jackson had said that Saruman's actually chanting to wake up Caradhras or something. And my response to that is, well, that didn't come across. So
no, not at all. Oh, that's come on, man.
Whatever.
Nice try. Try. No sale.
Exactly.
All right. Yeah. So I don't think we have any other questions from the chat. Did we touch on everything that we wanted to touch on as panelists?
I think so.
I think it was a very fun conversation, and I thank you both for being here so much.
Well, thanks for organizing it, Luke.
Yeah, this is fun. A fun little midday.
Oriana.
Yeah.
And we don't have that much longer left to wait to figure everything out. Only what is it? 3 more weeks? Something like that?
Oh my God, yeah.
It's weird. All right. So I hope you both have a good rest of the day. And for all of those of you who were watching live or watching the recording, I hope you also have a good day. Feel free to check out Oriana's other podcast, By the Bywater. Check out Sara Brown's other podcasts. You're going to have to remind me of the name of it.
Prancing Pony Podcast. And it'll be the Rings of Power Roundup.
Rings of Power Roundup. Okay.
By the Prancing Pony Podcast.
And then, of course, the Tolkien Experience podcast. Again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Luke.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We really enjoy making these podcasts, and the fun doesn't stop here.
That's right. It continues on social media. You can find us on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and Twitter as @TolkienEXP. Don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking to our guests.
For even more content and to join our fellowship of supporters, check out our Patreon by going to patreon.com/TolkienExperience. Finally, you can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I'm at Luke B. Shelton.
I'm at SR Westvic.
And I'm at Aaron L. Palmadill. If you have questions or comments, you can send them to us by email at tolkienexperience@gmail.com.
If you want to know more about this week's guest, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.